Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, everyone. Thank you for Irene and Mutoni, who will be presenting. Irene is from ILRI, and Mutoni is from WLU. Um, Mutoni will tell us your universities are. We're really happy to have you. This is in particular because this is a work that started with a matchmaking event that we had in Cali, where I think Irene and Mutoni met for the first time, but that's where this cooperation started and the discussions about this project started. And then they received, I think in 2003, a small-scale funding from SPIA to try to get these going, to get the ideas going. So we've been trying to support this, believing that there is a great potential in this kind of cooperation when we manage to bring academic researchers with researchers from within the CGs. We think that this would be, hopefully, this is a good example of what could be done in these conditions. I understand that the project is still going its way and trying to get funding to really do it at scale. So let's hear about this project. And then Kelvin, so the organization is, we plan for 30 minutes of presentation, then 10 minutes of comments from Calvin, and then up to 20 minutes of discussion. Thanks, everyone. Please go ahead.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. My name is Irene Ganga. I work with ILRI, International Livestock Research Institute, and I'll be presenting our work today with my colleague, who has now become my academic partner, who has now become a friend and a colleague. Mutoni, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Mutoni Nganga. I'm at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada, and we'll be presenting this work with Irene. Although we're just the presenters, but we are collaborating with a larger group, both from IRI and also the academic side. Thanks.
Okay, so title of our presentation is Innovation on Participatory Rangeland Management, and we'll be sharing what we've come up with for our impact assessment study design. Just as an introduction, participatory rangeland management, we have a step-by-step process where we let the community lead. So we support the community to be able to improve how they manage their rangelands. And we also seek to secure tenure so that it gives them more ownership of the process and what they're doing. And in the end, we see some benefits in the livelihoods and the local economies, as well as empowering women in the process. So currently, we are working in Wajir and Baringo counties here in Kenya, but with a plan of scaling out to other countries, including Senegal, in the coming years. So what kind of constraint are we addressing with PRM? PRM addresses rangelands degradation. It also looks at land tenure and security and how to improve that. And we strengthen governance in communities by providing some collective action so that people come together and improve the natural resources of the areas that they live in. And how we do that is by, like I mentioned, collective and inclusivity. And then we build the capacity of these communities and institutions that run in this community. We call them the rangeland management institutions. And then now coming together with as community and other actors, that's maybe NGOs or development partners, and maybe county government here in Kenya, for example. And then now we provide the technical support, which now enables the communities to go ahead and do practices such as rangeland restoration. And in the process, we see improvement in the areas that they live in. So this is just a summary of a PRM process. It starts with the investigating stage. So in this part, we first know who are the rangeland resource users, and then now they decide also the rangeland management unit, and then now we go ahead into negotiation, where now we discuss what do they want to see in their rangelands, what is the situation of the rangelands currently, what is their vision for where they would like their rangelands to be, and then now they come up with a rangeland management plan. And then now we get into an agreement who is going to do what in the community. So they seek out the roles of each and every person, including the stakeholders such as the county government or the NGOs. And then now from there, we go into implementation. So that's where we now apply the technical support, the technical practices, and then now learn from this so that we can have a monitoring process going on. So it's a cyclic process, and it's community owned, and it's participatory. It's a very important part of PRM. As I mentioned, the 3 stages, each of them has steps. So our first step is to know what are the resources and who are the users. The second step is if they have a management institution. If they don't have one, how can we set up one? But in most cases, because of previous intervention by other NGOs, you find that most of these rangelands have management institutions. So in that case, we just strengthen them by building their capacity so that we discuss things about ownership, accountability, and governance. And the third step is to now go ahead and they decide what is their rangeland management unit. And then we prepare a rangeland resource assessment, which gives us an idea of what the rangeland looks like and what interventions, technical expertise we can support them with. The fourth step is now where I mentioned we develop a rangeland management plan, and this is developed by the community themselves, but we provide the support that they need. And the fifth step is establishing the rangeland management agreement. So in terms of how are they going to work within the community, how will they work with their neighbors, and how will they work with the government authorities that are present. So that step 2 to 5 gives us the second stage, which is negotiation in PRM. And then the third stage is where we do the implementation. So we discuss what the roles of the communities will be, what is the role of the rangeland management advisors, and then now we go into the technical bits, where now we address the specific issues that are in the rangelands. And then now the cyclic part of it is where we do the monitoring and evaluation. How do we select our sites? The intervention that is, the part of the intervention that is randomized is the selection of the intervention site or community. And the level of this intervention is we target a landscape setup so that we don't have, because some of these things, they don't just work at a smaller level, but we look at a broader level. So we do landscape mapping of intervention sites. So the selection of the site to work in is a part of it that will be randomized. I'll hand it over to Modoni to proceed with the next slide.
Sorry, yeah. Thanks, Irene. Now, interventions such as the one that Irene has just described are usually short-term, or I would call them like a one-time intervention in each site. But the intention is that the impacts will be long-lasting or long-term. So then there's a relevant question as to whether such interventions would have persistent impact on collective action norms that would be enough incentives for these communities to continue engaging in collective action behavior, and in particularly managing their resources, even post the PRM implementation stages that we just described. Or in other words, in resource-constrained environments, success of this intervention really hinges on the ability to change local institutions and to change communities by, for example, improving their collective action behavior so that the communities can continue engaging in restoration activities even after an NGO has left a site. Now, with these policy goals in mind, our research questions are: 1, do PRM activities improve collective action norms in the targeted communities? And then question 2, to check whether the decision to participate in PRM restoration activities can be explained by innate or baseline characteristics of the individuals in the communities. Or I would put it in another way, like, for example, just asking the question whether unobserved individual norms explain the heterogeneities in behavior, or when it comes to asking the individual community members to sacrifice or to use their time to contribute to the public good or in the restoration activities. And we see our research questions really fitting in the LNC initiative outcome, which is targeting that pastoralists and farmers adopt improved governance and management of their restoration of their resources and restoration practices on their land that they use for livestock production, with at least a 25% increase in women participation in decision-making processes. Now, to answer these questions, we are proposing, I think I skipped a slide there. We are proposing to use lab-in-field experiments as a research design or study design. And for the first question, whether PRM activities improve collective action norms in the targeted communities, we can do either of one, having a baseline in a new site where PRM has not yet been implemented, and then a follow-up 1 year or after more than 1 year to see whether outcomes from public goods games before any intervention would be any different from outcomes after the intervention. But another way we could do it is go to Baringo, one of the sites in Kenya. So in Baringo, there's already an old site where PRM has already happened or being implemented, and then have individuals play public goods games there, and then compare the outcomes from those experiments with outcomes from experiments from a new site. So one, have a baseline and a follow-up, or two, have a baseline for a new site, and then again, experiments in an older site. And then to answer the question whether there would be differences or not differences, but whether the innate or baseline collective action norms or behavior would explain the individual's participation in PRM activities, then would be conducting these public goods games in the new site, and then comparing the outcomes or correlating the outcomes from the experiments with the outcomes from the actual participation using admin data, because then the LNC initiative would record participation of individuals in the communities when they are called for meetings, when they are called to participate in the restoration activities. To explain this further, this is the data that would be collecting. So one, data from the experiment, and the experiment will set it up in such a way that we have people participating in groups of 5 to 6 people per group, and an individual will be asked to contribute days to a private activity that will earn a private return, or have some days towards a public activity that would then gain, or the gain would be a public return. So that public return, or the return from the public activity, would be shared equally among the group members. Then with these outcomes, what the return is will actually be actual money, just to make it incentive compatible, and the outcomes from the experiments would be used to construct the degree of collective action for every individual in the group. And then, so that is data from the experiment. And then we'll also have data, or admin data, and this is the data that will record the number of days, the number of hours that an individual would have participated in, say, the restoration activities. So to answer the question, whether individual decisions in collective action experiments can actually predict participation in PRM activities, we'll then be comparing outcomes of the experiments and admin data for the new site only, like for the new Baringo site only. And then to answer the question whether PRM activities improve collective action behavior in the targeted communities, we will be using data from the new site, and then follow-up data from the new site also after, say, 1 year or 1.5 years. But with the same question, we can compare data from the new site, or sorry, when I say data, I mean here, public goods games outcomes from the new site and the old site. And I mean, we recognize this is not very clean in terms of how we're doing it, because we don't have baseline characteristics for the older site, because we didn't have games then for the older site. So we're just coming in now. And then we'll also collect household survey data just to ensure that we can control for socioeconomic characteristics. Steps forward. So we've mentioned that this is work that we haven't done and we don't have funding for it as yet, but SPEAR funded the scoping exercise that we conducted last year just to go to sites where PRM has not been implemented and also a site where PRM has been implemented, and just to collect some qualitative data on collective action behavior and norms of the different communities, just to be sure that there's something that we can get there in terms of the differences before and after PRM intervention. And we think there could be something. So once we get funding, we go to the field before PRM is implemented in the new Baringo site. So before anything has happened, the new Baringo site has already been determined. It's only that nothing has happened there as yet. And then in future, I think the Livestock and Climate Initiative is also planning to go out to Senegal. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. It's, as you see, it's a presentation of a design, so it's maybe you don't need the full 30 minutes, and it's fine. So we're lucky to have Kelvin to share some comments. Kelvin works at the World Fish, and who is also who has been really doing lots of good publications and is a successful example of a researcher coming out of a great research project. So now you can share your experience here and provide some advice and some comments, please.
Yeah, thanks, Rashid. Yeah,
He's at ILRI.
Yeah, my name is Kelvin Shikuku. I work at ILRI. But I mean, last time when we interacted with Rashid, I was still with World Fish in Penang, and that's also when I was making my presentation about that impact evaluation design. Yeah, so yeah, thanks a lot, Irene, and thanks Udoni for this really interesting.
Should we stop sharing the previous slides, perhaps?
Study.
Stop sharing the previous slides and we can see each other.
Do you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you well.
Okay.
And now we see you.
And now you see me as well. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. Once more, I was just thanking Irene and Mudoni for a very interesting study. It's important, I think, that we recognize that community level interventions that are aimed at strengthening local institutions, you know, for better management of natural resources, really hold huge promise here in terms of not only achieving improved well-being, but I think also really contributing towards environmental sustainability, and especially if you think about it, you know, under the increasingly volatile climatic conditions. So this is typically the case in the drylands, and the PRM therefore provides an excellent example of a community level intervention in such settings. Just looking at it, I see PRM as a bundled intervention comprising of among other aspects, you know, activities related to, for example, setting up or strengthening institutions, developing a rangeland management plan, you know, establishing management agreements, and even, you know, seeing how new roles could be formed for communities and rangeland management advisors. And I think this is fine, right? Especially in light of the increasing recognition and the insights promoting bundled, you know, innovations for agri-food transformation, especially where there seems to be clear complementarities among the activities. But this also presents a challenge, right? Impact assessment of such community level intervention that also have kind of bundled, that are kind of bundled, you know, is important, but it's also challenging. And so for me, it's encouraging to therefore see the team taking up this challenge. So I only have a few comments here that aimed to maybe trigger thoughts and maybe make the team think a little bit further as they even refine the design. So first, I think from the slides, I understood, even though there's the use of the language around randomization, I understood that the research design is not a randomized evaluation. Instead, my understanding is that this study will define rangeland management units, in Kenya and Tanzania as well. And PRM will be implemented in all the identified rangeland management units. A random sample of households will be drawn in each of those units, and the baseline will be conducted. Where possible, Modoni mentioned, I think in some cases, the opportunity for a baseline was missed. But I think the idea was that before the implementation of PRM, there would be a baseline. And then public good games will be, implemented with all study participants at baseline and endline as well. So the intention, therefore, is not to randomize any parts of the bundled intervention. And so I think the question of the level of randomization may not be appropriate in this case. But just to turn to the first research question, which is basically asking, do PRM activities improve collective action norms in the target communities? Here, the idea is to use data on before and after, and with and without PRM. And individual participation will be measured using admin data. But for me, I think also a clear definition of participants and non-participants in the context of PRM is going to be extremely important, right? To ensure that you can actually construct a clear counterfactual. So therefore, looking at the PRM stages would be good to understand how is participation in PRM defined in this case. Who is the participant? Who is not who is a non-participant, right? So, for example, is there a minimum set of activities that an individual must be involved in for them to be considered a PRM participant? So how do we define these participants? And then a second question that might be related to this, or a second point, would be, in this context, given the important role that social networks play, there's a high likelihood that non-participants, will interact with participants, right? Possibly learning about the activities and updating their beliefs, etc. And so even though you don't directly intervene those participants, given that they are drawn from the same kind of community, there's going to be spillovers, right, to non-participants and possibly shaping outcomes of the public goods game. So it is possible, therefore, the way I see it, to learn whether this type of a thing happened or not. For example, you could ask participants whether they discussed with others. But if the intention is to avoid such a scenario, then I think some careful thoughts need to go again into the research design, right? And how such issues could be minimized. And then the idea of comparing, I think, outcomes of the public goods games for the old site and the new site sounds interesting. But again, in these places, drylands are heterogeneous, right? And several other factors, some of those we can observe, some of those we cannot. But some of the factors there are factors in these sites that will influence the willingness to contribute to a public good games outcomes, right? So you may want here again to think carefully about how to select the new site to ensure that they are comparable to the old site, right? And just related to this is also that information sometimes tend to travel quite fast in the drylands, especially again through networks. And even though distances might seem large, or people sometimes tend to place radius, between communities, these may not really hinder information diffusion, especially about such an important topic. And so it's possible, therefore, that in the comparison site, even though PRM has not been officially introduced, people may already start implementing certain PRM-like activities which might actually shape their willingness to contribute to a public good game. So again, I think for me, the question is, what could be done, perhaps at the design of the definition of the rangeland management units to minimize that these types of scenarios would happen, or, thinking about some of those factors that might confound the effect of the, participation, and perhaps also having a way of controlling for those. And then just as a way of concluding here and speaking a bit on the second research question, which is, do individual decisions in collective action experiments predict participation in PRM activities? The public good games, as I understood them in this for this particular research question, will be implemented at baseline. And since the outcome participation in PRM is measured at the end line, it sounds reasonable then that we should not expect a reverse causality kind of a problem here. However, some of the PRM components, for example, such as rangeland management institutions, or even the rangeland management plans, might be something that already exists at baseline, right? Again, maybe autonomous, it may not be something that the team has has triggered, but there may be some efforts already going on, and may not be the entire eight stages, but some components of what PRM looks like might already be going on in these places. And so since we are unable to disentangle the effect of the different components of PRM, is it possible that some of the activities that might already be autonomously going on and are related to the components of PRM will also influence collective action norms, even at baseline? And so, again, I think the question here is, will the sampling frame, for example, consider only areas where none of the components of PRM exist? Can we aim for something like that? Is it feasible? Or have you thought about possible ways, for example, to address this particular issue, using the current design? So those are some of the thoughts that just came to my mind looking at the study and the proposed research, and so happy to also hear the thoughts of the research team. Yeah, thanks, Rashid, and back to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much for the comments. Mutoni and Irene, do you want to have some first reactions to these comments, or do you want to take more comments right away?
I think maybe we can respond to some of this. Well, yeah. Okay, I could go and then Irene has something to add, then fine. So let me start with the last one, and thanks so much, Kevin, for taking the time to read our work and to give all the feedback. We are grateful. So the first one on the existence of other management committees. So I'll just talk from my experience when we're doing the scoping exercise, and maybe Irene has more experience because she has worked on this in these areas longer than I have. So we did a scoping exercise in Wajir and in Baringo, and for all the community, from all the communities members that we talked to, I mean, everybody was saying, yes, we have some committees. It's just that, and even the key informant was saying they have some committees. The only thing is, when you move on to the next question and ask them, okay, what are their responsibilities? What do they do? Then most of them got stuck there, because what happens is that these committees are there, but they're not very active. But that also says that it's important to think very much about the question that you're asking here, that, when you have this whole sampling frame, then the participants now in the games, could there be some of them who are coming from areas that maybe the management committees could be more active than others? If that's something to carefully consider. But I think I remember well that the management committees for the areas that at least we went to seem to be dormant. And therefore now LNC initiative going in is almost something new, that now they are actually, and I think part of what they do, and Irene can explain this better, is they do not aim to establish like new management committees in those areas. They actually want to work with the ones that have been there to, I think, to strengthen them. But I'm saying Irene can explain that better. And then, sorry, I have to cough. Just a second. Yeah, thanks. Then then there's question on, what is participation really? And I think I'll just answer it halfway and I'll let Irene add. Yeah, because I think from the beginning, they want to engage the communities from the beginning of the process. So they call them for meetings, they ask them about the presence of management committees, and that participation is recorded even before they go to the actual restoration activities. So you're right, it's important for us to think about, when you're talking about the admin data that records participation, what exactly is participation? Is it just coming for the meetings and not participating in the restoration activities? Or is it participating in the restoration activities and not doing something extra? So the way I thought about it initially is, the actual contribution to the public good that implies some kind of sacrifice to something that you could be doing on your private land. And to me, that sounds like then coming to participate in these restoration activities, but maybe you should carefully think about that. Yeah, so let me stop there for now and let Irene say something.
Irene, do you want to add something? We also have a question from Berber that either I could read, but go ahead first, Irene, if you want to answer something.
Okay, thank you, Kelvin, for your comments and for sharing your ideas on how this study looks like. And certainly I've seen these areas that can be enhanced, which is very crucial right now before we come up with the actual questions that will be used, such as in the survey or before we get into implementing this study. I'd like to mention something about the site selection, because some that we also went back and forth with Muthoni about, and some that we have discussed in the PRM team on making it clear how the site selection is done, because it might not clearly appear as a randomized approach based on the way it's currently being done. So this is something that we are, Fiona, Jason, and I, and the rest of the PRM partners are working on, so that if anyone wants to replicate what we are doing, then the site selection is very clearly outlined, so that you know what steps to follow. And then from that time, then it'll be easier to explain how the site selection process is being done. The question on how the criteria that we're using to involve a PRM participant, I think that's something that we'll have to look at and maybe put down this criteria just as the same way as site selection, so that it's very clear if this is to be replicated even in other parts as we scale out, then this is also a very crucial part of it. The question about the spillover effects and what communities have done even before we show up as LNC initiative, this has also come up before, and we'll need to find ways of controlling for this. One of the ways is to clearly outline where our community is when we start the study, so that what step or what stage are they in the PRM process, so that with that kind of information, then we'll be able to tell if, say, one community is at step 2 and another one is at step 3 or 4, how does that affect how their responses are? So this is something that we'll take into account even as we go into implementing the study.
Thanks. Berber had a question. Are you
Yeah,
able to
so
ask
I
a
was
question?
wondering, I hope my mic works. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so I was wondering, considering that the groups, the management institutions have been established by NGOs, I'm assuming that came with some kind of capacity strengthening. And so I'm really wondering, given that they have gone dormant, isn't there a big risk that might happen again? And what is being done different this time around by LNC? Thanks.
So I'll take that. Thank you, Baba, for your question. So it's true, in some areas that we've gone, we find that maybe there could be some NGOs that were there, In some areas that we go, you find maybe there weren't NGOs that were there. But it depends on what the NGOs wanted to do, because a lot of NGOs say they do natural resource management, but our approach is a participatory bit of it, where we let the communities tell us what is it that they want to learn, how is it that they want to improve their areas, and then now we provide them the capacity building based on what their needs are. So it's a response, we respond to their needs. So rather than just coming up with, this is what we have and this is what we're going to come and give you as an NGO. So allowing the community to lead the process, then we give them the right support, and involving what you asked about, like what will not make them go dormant again. The idea that we have, and which has worked before, is involving the local administrative governments that are present, so that even beyond the time that such as LNC initiative is there, if it's a 2 to 3 year program, then the county governments or the local administrative governments can continue supporting these communities. And because this is something that they wanted to do as a community, then the ownership really helps to propel this work forward, as opposed to us coming in with our own ideas.
Steve, thank you. So those kinds of mechanisms might also be good to measure, to collect data on.
Okay.
Kelvin?
Yeah, thanks, Irene, and thanks, Mudoni. I just wanted to quickly follow up about the committees, right? I mean, the PRM, one of the objectives of PRM is to strengthen local institutions, but then the committees that exist in these drylands may not necessarily have been formed with that objective in mind, right? I mean, there's also increasing recognition that there's formal rules being implemented in the in more or less the same site, and then sometimes those might be triggered by situations, other factors such as conflict, or other other things that might be going on there. And so I think another thing to consider here is how those, on one hand you have the informal, but on the other hand, in the context, there is implementation of some formal or promotion of some formal type of institutions, and how do those interact with the type of intervention that that you're rolling out? Because that could possibly, for example, result to a crowding out of those informal institutions rather than strengthening those, right? But it could also be, as you mentioned, that there might be complementarity, so such that it's really not eroding the local institutions, but it's rather strengthening. But I think recognizing that in these setups is not just PRM promoting local institutions, but there are other interventions going on that sometimes may not really be targeting strengthening of those local institutions, and how do those interact with the intervention. And I think that speaks again to the design, because the way I get it here is there are two separate issues. There's the random sampling, which I think is what you're trying to do, but I'm still unclear that this is a randomized evaluation. And so some of these aspects, including the points that Baba was mentioning, will clearly interact with the intervention being promoted.
Do you want to, should we collect questions and then you answer it? Yeah. Despite being the moderator, I'm raising my hand myself also to be in line. A few questions. I think one connects to Barbara's comment, and I think it's knowing what is the story there in terms of how the impacts happen and why it is different. So just perhaps it would be useful to know if there is qualitative evidence, or is it more an intuition that this, from your experience in the field implementing this, that this is perhaps one big success story in some way, and that it can really have some impact, that it really has been sustainable, and that you see that even years later, things still are implemented in a different way thanks to the PRMs, and that is really translating into something different in the field. So just kind of the qualitative story behind this, I think, would be super useful to know why you think it's making a difference. That's on the kind of the qualitative, and on the quantitative and the identification topics. On the identification strategy that you have, obviously you'll have a number of challenges, and understanding that it's fully, you have to deal with maybe an RCT is not something feasible in this case. And but sort of this design where you will have a before and after for the new ones and only the after for the others kind of give you a number of troubles, right? One is you always have heterogeneity between the previous ones and the new ones. And so when you will, if you compare the new ones with the previous ones, sort of before and after, you don't really know what is due to the treatment, what is due to heterogeneity from two things. One is perhaps the selection bias of the first ones, but the second one is also, I think, so how many communities do you have? Because your observation sort of, since the game is kind of at the community, you expect a strong covariance within a community, right? Cooperation is really estimated at a community level. How many do you have in each ones? If you have just this number to help me continue the comments.
For now, I'm not certain about the, oops.
But the order of magnitude of how many communities should we expect sort of treated and controlled?
No, I do not have like a certain number in terms of the number of communities per site. So, and by community,
the number of sites. Let's count it in sites, please.
Oh, okay. So for now we are talking about 2 sites, an old site and a new site. And then,
but in a new site, it's a whole set, or is it? Okay, one site is one set. It's not many different places. Think of, it's really implemented at a very large scale.
Yeah. So
but maybe one way Mudhoni to think about it is there's a mention of defining the rangeland management units. So, for example, how many of those would you think would be constructed?
Yeah, I think
maybe that's the right terminology, as it, or it's at the end, one site brings many rangeland management units, and you got to work with all of them together, right? You cannot, it's not something that you could think of as different groups, however you name it.
The sites as we have them right now is really defined as a rangeland management unit, and it can be at the scale of, here in Kenya, it can be at the scale of a location. So it's not one site that has several little sites in them. It's just one. If it's one site, it's one rangeland management unit. So now comparing that as a new site or an old site with another site elsewhere. And you can do as many as you can, but the more you do, the more funds that are needed to make the comparison.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. So currently we have to start with like 2 for each area, like comparing an old site in Baringo with a new site in Wajir, or comparing 2 sites within Wajir, like a new site where no PRM has been done, and maybe the other one would be what is it, like where we want to do PRM and where no PRM is going to be done, and then compare that at the end line.
And I think Isabel is commenting, I wonder if a qualitative assessment is better in this case. I'm partly going in this direction as well, in terms of, I think you can't really present it as a purely quantitative study in that sense, because you don't really have the law of large numbers that allows you to really consider that if there is some differences between the two, it should not be random. But it's useful now between a before and an after. There is, even only from the fact that I know Juan Camilo Cardenas, who is my colleagues and kind of someone that does a lot of these cooperation games, and they found that when they go back to the same communities, the communities also learn to play the game, and they realize that if they cooperate better, then they will get more of this pool of money that these foreign researchers full of money are bringing. So they start learning. There is a learning in these games, right? And so between the before and after, so my first suggestion was, even if you have a before and after, ideally you have also a before and an after in some other units, even if it's not the ones that received the treatment before. Perhaps that's more useful, because at least in your regression, perhaps if you will have a regression for this, then maybe it's useful to think early on, how do you, because then you have either before or after, or comparing this community before to another community after. But you kind of have to do separately the two regressions, but it's hard to combine as opposed to if you have before and after for the same community. Now, indeed, in any case, it's true that this is a case where perhaps in any case you won't have exactly the sample size, but it's very common in some of these behavioral studies that they have small sample sizes because it's so costly to have some of these behavioral games, and you cannot have so many of these. So I think for the kind of the behavioral literature, it's okay to have something, but maybe seeing it as a bit more of a descriptive thing, and with the qualitative stuff, that it's a mix between quantitative and descriptive, but it's kind of not in the realm of purely quantitative work in that sense, because you know that you don't have the exact. And so in the way it is presented, and I think being heavier on the qualitative, that really tells the story of why things may be changing, or thinking perhaps within rangeland management units, are there some people more treated than others, more involved than others, that change more between baseline and after? Sort of maybe there is within the rangeland management unit, there is some elements that are useful in variation also to help you kind of test that it's really the involvement in this that it's a bit endogenous, but it could be useful because you're still comparing the before and after on these people. So I would encourage you to think of all these opportunities in the framing. And I think, but knowing that, as Calvin was saying, it is challenging because it's something that's happening at scale, because it's kind of an input that is not easy to define. So it's not because it's challenging that on the opposite, it makes it even more interesting if you manage to draw some lessons about this, even if it's not perfectly defined. But just these are some recommendations and possible directions to take. Thanks. And just to add, Isabel, do you want to talk to make your beyond what you wrote? Do you want to add something?
Not really. I think I mean, we've learned that sometimes if you try to force a bit a randomized control trial and then it fails, and then it's disappointing, right? And maybe doing a very strong qual assessment. I was wondering as well, maybe something about on gender norms and how those besides the norm that you have mentioned in your presentations, would as well, you would have a chance as well to identify some of those norms, gender norms, that they actually prevent or support stronger rangeland management. If you do a qual assessment, you may have a chance to do it that way. So yeah, I was just thinking about that different options. Yeah, but yeah, looking forward to hearing more about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Isabel. Ruth?
Thanks. Very interesting. I'm glad, Rashid, that you mentioned Juan Camilo Cardenas's work, because that was going to be part of my question. We've been doing work to look at how games can influence collective action. And so, first of all, there is a little bit of controversy about whether you have to give incentivized payments to get accurate, whether people will respond even without incentivized payments. So that is one consideration. But more importantly, there's a lot of work about how if you use the games with a debriefing, they can actually stimulate stronger collective action in the future. And so I was wondering if you had given any consideration to that, and several possibilities. But first of all, you could deliberately use them, and there's a whole lot on how that can be done. But even if you don't, what you basically have to do is add on a debriefing. afterwards, which takes what people do in the game and think about how that influences how that relates to their own experience, and then what kinds of lessons they have and how that might influence what they want to do in the future. So that's my main question. And we've been doing this in India with collective action games for groundwater management and surface water management. And we can tell you a whole lot about the complexities of measuring that, but just wanted to ask if you had given any thought to that.
Yeah, I can respond to
Please, yeah.
some of the comments, and again, I'll just start with the last one, because the last one is actually a question that we had thought about as our third research question, where we had thought of using or asking whether these games could be used as a pedagogical tool that then would influence collective action behavior, which comes now to participating in the rangeland management and restoration practices. But now, after discussing, we were a bit in doubt of whether, in our case, this would be an interesting policy question in this case. And I mean, we had gone through the work of Abby Turiansky. I think they did this in Haiti. And so we dropped that question for that case, I mean, for that reason, because we were not sure of the scalability. So if we have answers, and now with the work that LNC initiative are doing, how scalable is this? And we're looking at maybe answering questions that would give them some kind of answers that are important for scalability, but maybe something we can go back to. But that's what we thought about. And then after discussing, we dropped it. And to the questions on endogeneities, and I mean, we agree fully. Like I say, this is for sure not a clean design in that sense, because for sure we are not doing a randomized experiment here. And even the way the sites are selected, we're saying there's one site that has already been selected for intervention in Baringo. So that site, I think Irene said there's some kind of randomization, but I think it also depends on many other factors. But it's not a site that is selected from, say, many sites, and then they decide to go there. And even then, it's one site. So we wouldn't be talking of randomly selected units, and then we have all these control units. And I think going to Rashid's point, I think to your question, if I read it correctly, or if I read your mind correctly, I think what you were asking is whether within maybe a site, there could be smaller sites where then the intervention could happen in some sites and not in others. That's what I thought maybe you're asking, but then we don't have that. If it's a location, the intervention is in that location. And I mean, we understand the location is vast, that some of them might not, the impact might be higher for some people in the location and not others. But so the only randomization that we do is when we are now selecting the individuals to come to participate in the public goods games. So that's it. And so then we would imagine that these individuals, because they are randomly selected, then we have a whole mixture of individuals who were maybe highly impacted by these implementation practices or implementation, and others maybe who are a bit far. So we'd have randomization at that point, but not in the selection of the sites. And within a site, we don't have many different sites that we have others as treatment and others as control. But I also really appreciate these comments, and I think coming from many of you, that, well, having this limitation and with all these endogeneity issues that we are facing, then maybe a whole mixture of this descriptive work and qualitative work would be more useful in this case, without a claim of, causality, and might be even more important in terms of the policy questions that are, like, for instance, one of the goals is to ensure that there's a 25% increase in women participation. So what does this implementation or intervention do to improve women participation or collective action behavior by women? And this would then have to come from a mixture of some of this descriptive work, as maybe from the games, but also qualitative work, which we obviously haven't really thought much about at this point. If there is anything that you think I should also maybe comment on, please let me know. Put up, left up something.
No, I think it's great. I think it makes a lot of sense. Hey, Ruth, your hand is still on.
Oh,
Did you want to
sorry.
add something?
Sorry, I forgot to take it down, but I would be intrigued about what the Haiti study you said about scalability. But in India, we've done the games as an intervention in over 6,000 communities. So they are very scalable. In fact, that's part of the appeal of them, is the ability as a relatively low-cost intervention to increase collective action. So happy to follow up with you about that. In fact, I apologize. I came in a bit late because I was in a discussion with our team about our impact assessment that's ongoing on that.
Ruth, maybe there is something here that you could share in a future seminar. If you're interested, like write to me or to
Sure.
Nina. We could think of a seminar around this. I think it would be super useful to learn from your experience as well.
Sure, we'd be very happy to. Yeah.
Sounds great. And Victor, you raise your hand as well. Victor? Can you hear us? Maybe need to activate the volume to unmute. Victor, we can hear you. You need to unmute yourself, Victor. If not, you will have to write your comment if it's not working.
I think he had typed a comment, Rashid.
Yeah, but it's not working, right?
There is a comment from Victor about the time
But
But
effect.
it's only asking, can you allow me to talk?
no, there's an earlier comment in the chat, but for me it wasn't really clear. So I was hoping he would probably elaborate some more. At the beginning of the chat, he had written
I see the
something on time
time
effect.
effects and interventions and outcomes since you're dealing with a bundle of interventions, especially in the arm of the before and after design of your experiments. But are you able to talk, Victor? Can you unmute? Maybe I can try to unmute you myself if you can't. Have a problem.
I've tried. It has to sort of allow the mute.
Yeah.
But my understanding of his question is that he's wondering whether there's enough time between the before and after for the intervention to take effect. That's my understanding of his question.
And whether you are keeping over time track of the evolution or something like this.
Yeah, yeah, 1 year may not be enough time because of also feedback from the initiative, how long it takes for the community to then start implementing what they have learned, or maybe to continue, let me say, with the restoration activities. So we say 1.5 or maybe 2 years. So yeah, but that is not yet determined, but for sure, it would not be 1 year. Yeah.
I think we'll have to reach the end of this seminar. The unmute button is frozen, Victor. I think it's because when you get in the Zoom, sometimes you have to sort of accept the audio, and perhaps you haven't kind of accepted the audio at this stage, because we even cannot unmute you. So it's sometimes because you don't allow the microphone. But since it's 10, I encourage you to, through email, continue the conversation if you can. And thank you very much, everyone. I think it's super constructive. And it's also a very nice stage when it comes early on in the project, because it's a time where we can all feel like we're contributing to the design, and it's a good time to receive comments, hopefully useful. Thanks, everyone.